Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Langston Hughes Society session at the 2012 American Literature Association Conference. This year's panel is entitled Crisis, Catastrophe, Contagion in the Works of Langston Hughes and His Contemporaries. In 2012, we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Langston Hughes Society, although we mark this anniversary following the grim year of 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic that has led to multiple crises, not least of which has occurred in the arts and higher education. Despite the use of tools for virtual interaction, quarantines and travel restrictions across the globe have impacted social engagement and personal connections. Langston Hughes, who traveled extensively both domestically and internationally, might have found these closures a hindrance to his ability to take his poetry to the people, although he would have been very attuned to the suffering of the low-down folk, as he put it in The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. Hughes was no stranger to crises and catastrophes, both acute and chronic, such as the Great Depression and long-standing racial discrimination that manifested itself not only in outright violence, but also in housing and employment discrimination. Today, we have three very thoughtful presentations addressing the subject of crisis, catastrophe, and contagion in the work specifically of Langston Hughes and Claude McKay. Each presenter will take an opportunity to introduce themselves before entering into their presentation, and we hope to have a few minutes for dialogue at the end to trace out connections between their ideas and to reach some conclusions about the Harlem Renaissance era insights into these destabilizing conflicts. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker, Cole Morgan.
Hello, good morning for me, and I think good afternoon to both of you. Christopher, thank you for the work you've done to organize the panel and for your introduction to our meeting today. I'm going to jump right into my presentation titled Diasporic Disaffection in Claude McKay's Home to Harlem. How does the disaffected diasporic subject resist the spiritually deleterious effects of exile, alienation, and displacement? How do they keep from buckling under the traumatic weight of history and the memory of political violence? For members of the Black diaspora, a rendering of the social and political forces of the 20th century might very well resemble the Paul Klee painting titled Angel Novus, described by Walter Benjamin in his 1940 essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History. In Klee's rather abstract and relatively flat piece, Benjamin perceives a scene in which the storm winds of catastrophe propel the eponymous angel of history perpetually into the future. Despite this forward propulsion, the angel's gaze is fixed backwards on a past that Benjamin describes as, quote, one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. Benjamin calls the scene of suspension in which the angel, powerless to, quote, stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed, is forced to bear continual witness to the ravages of the past, progress. Benjamin's pessimistic interpretation certainly resonates throughout the Atlantic world, finding representative examples in most, if not all, of the theaters of colonial devastation that plagued the Western Hemisphere over the last 5 centuries. My questions as to the colonial subject's capacity to act in and in spite of the wake of colonial devastation seem to me like logical and urgent responses to Benjamin's bleak theory of historical progress. If not in response to Benjamin's essay, then perhaps in anticipation of its vision, Claude McKay's 1928 debut novel, Home to Harlem, provides a provocative reply to these questions of the colonized subject's relationship to history. The friendship that develops between Jake and Ray, the novel's 2 main characters, demonstrates 2 contrasting ideological reactions to the matter of colonial marginality. Scholars have long recognized Jake and Ray as foils designed to metonymize different, if not exactly opposed, expressions of modernist Black subjectivities. On the one hand, McKay presents Jake, an African-American soldier whose decision to desert the army during the First World War relegates him to a life of itinerant labor and leisure, constantly trying to evade the government. Ray, on the other hand, is marked by his Haitian nationality as a refugee, whose self-imposed exile informs every aspect of his social, political, and professional life. The two only meet in the second part of the novel after Jake has begun working aboard the same train as Ray. Over and against the unencumbered demeanor Jake enjoys throughout the rest of the novel, Ray's brief interlude in the middle of the text introduces an array of concerns that revolve around the political and social stakes of living with the memory of colonial violence. By reading Jake and Ray's friendship and examining their respective attitudes toward their present circumstances, this essay will meditate on the notion of historical consciousness as it pertains to Black diasporic subjectivity. Jake and Ray's friendship aboard the train begins with a concise history lesson. Unlike the acquaintances Jake makes throughout the rest of the novel, his relationship with Ray develops neither out of necessity nor convenience, but a desire for and an admiration of Ray's historical knowledge. And this is an extended quote. Jake sat like a big eager boy and learned many facts about Haiti before the train reached Pittsburgh. He learned that the universal spirit of the French Revolution had reached and lifted up the slaves far away in that remote island, that Black Haiti's independence was more dramatic and picturesque than the United States independence, and that it was a strange, almost unimaginable eruption of the beautiful ideas of the liberté, égalité, fraternité of mankind that shook the foundations of that romantic era. End quote. Ray's admiration of the French Revolution's ostensible ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity unmistakably inform his account of history and the pride he takes in Haiti's own independence. This is Ray's first articulation of the importance that Haiti holds for him as both a symbol of national identity and as an empirical example of a realized national ideal. Despite his enthusiasm, however, Ray's description of history here already belies the ambivalence that will immobilize him later in the novel. The quote, romantic era that Ray describes to Jake makes no mention of contemporary anti-colonial struggles, and instead attributes Haiti's recovery from its quote, remote colonial situation to the saving grace of the French Revolution's universal spirit. This conflation of the French and Haitian revolutions perpetuates two things at once: Ray's pining for an idealized national identity, and his inability to identify with the African American culture that Jake and the other railroad workers represent. If these twinned problems of neither fitting in nor seeing anywhere to fit into exacerbate Ray's feelings of melancholy and disaffection, finding a candid interlocutor in Jake gives Ray hope of transcending his hagiographic fixation on the past. Jake and Ray forge their friendship across the interracial strata of class and colorism that McKay details throughout the second part of the novel. Whereas Ray's extemporaneous lectures on the history of slavery, revolution, and other worldly topics deepen Jake's appreciation for the global span of Black solidarity, readers soon become aware of an inverse attenuation of such aspiration on Ray's part. When the train's crew arrive in Pittsburgh to recuperate, Ray's despair at the prospect of present-day broad-based racial solidarity comes to a head in a moment of self-denigration. Faced with bedbugs in his bunk, which he tries to combat by covering his mattress with pages from various Negro newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Negro World, and the Chicago Defender, such that he is literally suspended on the words and affairs of the African American public, Ray recoils in disgust at the Black bodies of his fellow crew sleeping around him. Quote, these men claimed kinship with him. They were Black like him. Man and nature had put them in the same race. He ought to love them and feel them if they felt anything. Yet he loathed every soul in that great barrack room except Jake, end quote. The visceral loathing Ray feels in the scene, though triggered by his intolerance for the workers snoring, reflects more than a shallow contempt. Indeed, quote, kinship claimed on the incidental grounds of genetic identity irks Ray because it supersedes the national identity he so cherishes. In the concept of race, Ray sees his idealized conception of history, all achievement and teleological progress, collapse into his present moment. This collapse signifies an inability on Ray's part to reconcile the greatness of his Haitian heritage with the banality of his personal situation and his immediate circumstances. This inability to reconcile his idealized past and his bug-ridden present is not a neat dualistic problem for Ray, but a complex series of contradictions that double back on themselves on both a diegetic and a textual level. When Ray tells Jake that his, quote, native language is French, Jake exclaims, ain't you one of us too? Ray's reply actually does little to clarify things. Quote, of course I'm a Negro, he explains, but I was born in Haiti and the language down there is French. Though Ray identifies himself racially as Black, he distinguishes himself from Jake nationally, claiming his Haitian heritage. Both categories, race and nation, seem to disgust Ray that evening in Pittsburgh, however. Quote, races and nations were things like skunks whose smells poisoned the air of life. Yet civilized mankind reposed its faith and future in their ancient silted channels, end quote. This condemnation contradicts Ray's earlier views, not only because of its acerbic tone, but also because of the second sentence quoted here, in which his aversion to the categories of race and nation suggests that they fail to accurately capture some historical dimension of their representative identities. Ray's metaphor suggests that society's problems rest, almost literally, in the uneven and shifting way its future sits on the sedimented composition of racial and national identities. As provocative as this critique is, Ray's thinking is caught up in itself, preoccupied with the confusion of excessive desire and no direction forward. Suspicious though he is of these, quote, silted channels, Ray cannot escape their current and thus remains unable to chart a way forward. By the time Ray reflects on this paralysis in his bunk in Pittsburgh, the novel has foreshadowed his ambivalence through his fixation on a Black past of inexorable progress and his self-imposed withdrawal from Black sociality. Ray is stuck in the rut of his convictions about Black racial and national identity. This is another extended quote. Ray felt that as he was conscious of being Black and impotent, so correspondingly each Marine down in Haiti must be conscious of being white and powerful. What a unique feeling of confidence about life the typical white youth of his age must have, knowing that his skin color was a passport to glory, making him one with 10,000s like himself, end quote. Race and nationality, in other words, work for white Americans in ways that it doesn't for Ray. In the same way that dwelling on his own Blackness evokes a sense of impotence, Ray reasons that recognizing one's whiteness must be synonymous with the evocation of power. Confidence seems to Ray to be a natural attribute of white youth. His ideation of a passport that makes each white person, quote, one with 10,000s like himself, might cynically correspond to the wonder he instilled in Jake on the train, who, quote, felt like a boy who stands with the map of the world in colors before him and feels the wonder of the world, end quote. Ray no longer wonders at the world, he does not have to, he remembers. For Ray, these notions of white supremacy, authority, and legion speak to the unevenness of political privilege, but they also hint at his experience of the American occupation of Haiti. Ray's memory of the American occupation of Haiti compounds his sense of alienation from the rest of the African American train crew by obscuring any hope of solidarity he might build between them. Ray's sense of difference, a difference that stems from his national identity, exceeds the category of race whenever he realizes that Haiti constitutes not only a subject of America's imperial rule, but also a blind spot for those he would call his brothers in arms. Black solidarity is something Ray expects to spring forth from his co-workers in the fashion of the universal spirit at the heart of the French Revolution. In lieu of such spontaneous salvation, Ray must settle for Jake, whose lone friendship he has to work to sustain, to cultivate. This is not the social revolution he dreams of, but the engaged process of mutually supportive friendship. What good is this friendship, though, based as it is on Jake's desire to live the present moment with mere bits of history explained now and again? This question drives Ray's ambivalence, both in the Pittsburgh Railroad quarters and for the rest of the novel. By the end of the second part of Home to Harlem, this challenge is beginning to dawn on Ray. After visiting a bedridden Jake, Ray reflects on his abandoned plans to become a writer by evoking the names of famous Russian authors, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, who, in his estimation, quote, seemed to stand up like giants. Here were elements that the grand carnage swept over and touched not. The soil of life saved their roots from the fire. They were so saturated, so deep down, rooted in it, end quote. Here, finally, Ray starts to demonstrate the emergence of a sense of vitality in the midst of devastation. His sense of saturation, articulated in terms of soil, rootedness, and fecundity, imply transformation, preservation, and growth. Quote, but what of it? Ray asks himself. Could he create out of the fertile reality around him, of Jake nosing through life, a handsome hound, quick to snap up any tempting morsel of poisoned meat thrown carelessly on the pavement, and the misery that overwhelmed him there? Ultimately, for Ray, the answer is no. His sense of alienation in the States overwhelms him, hence his flight to Europe. The Ray that Jake meets in the viewport of Marseille in McKay's To Home to Harlem banjo has settled in amongst a group of expatriate misfits whose sense of dislocation resembles Ray's own. And in this new community, Ray plays the part of the philosophically minded student. To examine the distance he has traveled since Pittsburgh, however, in terms of his outlook on life, it would be useful to look at one of Banjo's most popular passages, part of which was circulated between the same French student publications that would influence a generation of negritude artists and philosophers. After meeting a Martinican student in a bar who advises Ray against socializing with Senegalese workers living and laboring in the multicultural enclave of the Vieux-Port, Ray responds admonishingly. Quote, it's the common people, you know, who furnish the bone and sinew and salt of any race or nation. If this Renaissance we're talking about is going to be more than a sporadic and scabby thing, we'll have to get down to our racial roots to create it. Getting down to our native roots and building up from our own people is not savagery, it is culture. This sea change in Ray's character, his newfound belief that an answer to historical foreclosure lies with the roots of his race, signals not only a recovery of agency from the grip of history, but also a realization that self-liberation rests neither on race nor nation nor ethnicity alone, but instead perhaps on the hybrid and future-oriented cultivation of culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cole, for that thoughtful presentation. My dissertation was on the works of Claude McKay. And Home to Harlem is one of my favorite texts by McKay, particularly for the perspectives that you've offered in that paper. I think oftentimes there's a tendency to view Ray as sort of this deracinated Black intellectual, but the conversation about his racial leanings, I think, is deeper than just saying that he is trying to sever those ties, and he's really working through something a lot more complicated and more symbolic of the Black condition at large. So thank you again for that thoughtful presentation.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I will be delivering the next presentation. It is a pleasure to join you all here today as part of the Langston Hughes Society panel on crisis, catastrophe, and contagion in the work of Langston Hughes and his contemporaries. My name is Christopher Allen Varlack, an assistant professor of English at Arcadia University and current president of the Langston Hughes Society. As an educator and scholar, I'm particularly interested in the study of literature aimed at addressing the systems of racism and oppression at work in the United States, recognizing that texts of the past can play an integral role in framing strategies for social justice work in the present and in demonstrating a continuum of racial violence that informs the world in which we live today. For me, the work of Langston Hughes is especially important in that mission, for Hughes saw the power of the word in preserving that history that far too often is neglected or erased, in holding those who have perpetuated violence accountable in ways that the judicial system often does not, and in advocating the kinds of much needed social and political change that unfortunately Black, Indigenous people of color must still fight to achieve in the modern world. My most recent work, in which this presentation plays a small part, then centers on interconnections between the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Lives Matter movement, sparked in large part by the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012 by George Zimmerman. If we can use the literature of the past to acknowledge the ongoing realities of racism in the United States and across the globe, then we can challenge pervasive myths of racial progress and post-raciality and begin to move toward a platform for change. In this era, currently defined by an ongoing assault against critical race theory, this work seems all the more important, for these conversations are the entry point, not the end point, to erasing the color line, disrupting the status quo, and building a more equitable world for us all. In spring 1931, 9 African-American boys were arrested and subsequently convicted in the rape of 2 white women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, in what eventually became known as the Scottsboro case, an event that heightened existing racial tensions while at the same time inflaming the ire of a Black community frustrated by the rampant inequities of the judicial system and the general disregard for Black lives. Ultimately convicted, 8 of the boys were sentenced to death, and the remaining defendant was sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict was thus a clear reminder of how deeply the brute Negro myth had taken a stranglehold on society, subjecting the Black male to both exile and racial violence. Decades later, however, the racial landscape nationwide is not so much different. The over-policing of predominantly Black neighborhoods, the prominence of the for-profit industrial complex, and the development of the new Jim Crow, aptly defined by Michelle Alexander, have left many Blacks in a veritable exile in the prison and probation systems, while a string of Black deaths as a result of police brutality deny the African-American people access to those allegedly inalienable rights promised under the United States Declaration of Independence. And through it all, protests continued in blood-soaked streets. We need only log on to our social media or turn on our television screens to watch for our continued misery. Recognizing how the racial crises of the not too distant past persist, however, is only one step toward healing the fractures that plague society and addressing the inequities that ultimately rendered Blacks second-class citizens in a nation their ancestors built. Turning to the works of the past that promoted much needed commentary on the crises at hand proves just as valuable in understanding the roots of these issues, as well as the platforms such thinkers envisioned for social and political reform. Through the examination of Langston Hughes's 1931 one-act play, Scottsboro Limited, for instance, we can interrogate Hughes's critique of the judicial system and the underlying culture of racial discrimination that kept 8 Black boys in chains to show their pain. At the same time, we can probe the social justice agenda embedded within the play, specifically Hughes's call for Black and white workers to unite under the red flag to fight against the systemic oppression this controversial case revealed. By tracing Hughes's critique and his platform for widespread cultural reform in the 1930s, we can better understand potential avenues for social change today, recognizing that the case of the Scottsboro boys has only been replaced with more contemporary examples of the blatant disregard for Black lives, from the modern-day lynching of George Floyd to the live-streamed killing of Philando Castile. To more fully understand the state of racial terror that the Scottsboro case reveals, we must first trace how issues of judicial inequity and the perpetuation of racial violence in the Scottsboro case are historically rooted, for there is a genealogy of racism that informs these events as well as the racial climate of the present day. Ida B. Wells Barnett, author of the infamous A Red Record, aimed at chronicling the history of lynching Blacks in the United States, noted that The lynching tradition emerged in large part as a tool to preserve the status quo, recognizing that even with the development of Black codes post-emancipation, the threat of African-American advancement and uplift that was depicted in D.W. Griffith's 1915 The Birth of a Nation and the ever-present hatred for Black peoples necessitated for many white Americans a more aggressive approach to keep the African-American community in its assigned place. Therefore, according to Wells Barnett, because the operations of the law did not dispose of Negroes fast enough, lynching bees became the favorite pastime of the South. In fact, so bold had the lynchers become, masks were laid aside, the temples of justice and strongholds of law were invaded in broad daylight and prisoners taken out and lynched, while governors of states and officers of law stood and saw the work well done. What Wells Barnett refers to here is a system in which the very structures of the law that are intended to protect and preserve the rights of U.S. citizens are denied the African American community, resulting in a climate in which Black men and women are silenced, unable to mount a defense against what is often the unsupported word of any white person for any cause, and in which the legal authorities sanction what is done by failing to prosecute and punish the murders. The realities that Ida B. Wells Barnett outlines in her work speak to systemic issues still present over 30 years later when the Scottsboro case earns national attention, sparking the social and literary campaign of Langston Hughes. After all, the culture of racism at the time instilled a de facto system of Black inferiority evident as the testimony of African-American defendants was still held in lesser regard than the testimony, substantiated or not, of their white counterparts. Not to mention the blatant failure to include any African-Americans on the jury, or the pattern of police corruption that contributed to the guilty verdict, eventually contested all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Ruby Bates, for instance, declared in a letter that those policemen made me tell a lie. Those Negroes did not touch me. A document that reveals the depth of police misconduct and the societal need to place guilt allegedly to preserve the innocence of the white woman, even if that entailed the oppression of the Black community and the perpetuation of violence against Black lives. What this reveals most clearly, however, is the ways in which the notion of the brute Negro was ingrained in the US cultural and political imagination, rendering Black men a constant danger and ignoring the brutishness that far too often accompanied white rage and white fragility. Recognizing this conflict, Hughes authored Scottsboro Limited, both the play and what Jason Miller refers to as his poetic campaign, to challenge the system itself and to ensure that the lynch laws do not prevail. Consistent with Hughes's goals as a self-proclaimed social poet, one who cannot write exclusively about roses and moonlight, for sometimes in the moonlight my brothers see a fiery cross and a circle of Klansmen's hoods, Scottsboro Limited begins with an overt social and political critique in order to address the everyday hardships faced by the African-American community in this prejudicial society. Chained together, the 8 Black boys on trial declare that every star in the flag is stained with a lie, and that there is no darker cell any worse than this here Southern hell. Though the play itself does not address the specific nature of the lie, the treatment of the African-American people throughout history suggests that the very notion of democracy and the undergirding promises upon which it was built are that lie. For the Black community has never been represented in or been able to take advantage of the opportunities afforded in the American dream. More importantly, however, the words these 8 Black boys communicate call attention to the pervasive oppression, as well as the restrictions placed upon African-American social, economic, and political mobility that makes the South akin to hell. Jim Crow ideology, after all, was widespread, contributing to the alienation and disenfranchisement of Black peoples while promoting state-sponsored discrimination and at times state-sponsored violence as a means to preserve the system in place. Integral to this initial conversation is the response of the white man in their presence, who condemns their words essentially as anti-patriotic and anti-American, language notably prominent in the modern world where discussions of the racist infrastructure at the heart of the United States are also cast off as anti-American in an effort to delegitimize the Black Lives Matter movement, seen by some, albeit erroneously, as a terrorist organization. Here, the white male figure questions, do you want to get arrested for treason? Which only reinforces how any open critique of the United States, and by nature the system of white supremacy at its core, is labeled treasonous in an effort to silence dissent. That silencing, however, inhibits the kinds of social change that Black, Indigenous people of color demand after centuries of marginalization and active oppression. Herein lies the second layer of Hughes's critique in the text, for he argues that we will be dead if we stay quiet here. That's why we come tonight, to lift our troubles high like a flag against the sky. The language in this passage is reminiscent of other works by Hughes, specifically his 1949 poem Democracy, in which he argues that I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Both works promote a critical unsilencing of the African-American community as essential to bring about that more perfect union that the United States claims to be, and to illustrate the resolve of Black, Indigenous people of color to let the world see that even in chains, we will be free. As we can see, the spirit of resistance and reform is ever present in this play, a direct response not only to the judicial inequities that led to their arrest and conviction, but also the longstanding tradition of racism that has led so many people of color to similar fates. In that sense, Scottsboro Limited aims to highlight the root causes of Black misery. See also Hughes's 1969 text, Black Misery, and the nature of US racial terror that still persists today. Part of that Black misery is the presumption of Black guilt and the belief among some in the 1930s, and perhaps even today, that a trial's too good for Black bastards. Imagine a trial for niggers. This ideology is evidenced in the history of extrajudicial killings, part of the work that I.W. Wells Barnett accomplished in A Red Record, and that we see at work today in the murders of Black men and women such as George Floyd. In the infamous video that circulated throughout the media for weeks, people across the globe had the opportunity to see the last minutes of George Floyd's life as now convicted officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds for allegedly using a counterfeit bill. His murder and the subsequent deluge of racist sentiment online, with white teenagers reenacting the video in mocking imitation, all communicated the same message: that George Floyd's life held no value in US society and that a trial was unnecessary, for his criminal past already marred him with guilt. Like the boys in the Scottsboro case, George Floyd was rendered the brute Negro in that moment, and as many expected, the legal authorities would sanction what is done by failing to prosecute and punish the murderer. That Derek Chauvin was convicted and sent to prison for his actions was an anomaly, a far cry from the racial progress that some believe it to be. There are too many Black bodies now buried with no one held accountable for their deaths. Ultimately, there's so much more left to learn from Scottsboro Limited by Langston Hughes, not covered in this limited presentation. Material that I plan on exploring in a larger chapter that will be included in a volume in development focused on intersections of the Harlem Renaissance era and the Black Lives Matter movement. But what is most important for us to take away from this initial conversation is that we are not far removed from the racial terror of the world in which Langston Hughes lived. Black men and women are still put on trial in certain regions with the presumption of their guilt. Prosecutors can still find end runs around Batson versus Kentucky, and Black, Indigenous people of color still find themselves trapped within the prison industrial complex with a school to prison pipeline that has become symbolic of the new Jim Crow. Mining these lesser studied works by Langston Hughes and his contemporaries can then be an important entry point for understanding how racism has historically operated and how it still operates in the present day. Thank you very much. And our final presenter as part of this panel will be Dr. Joshua M. Murray.
Thanks, Christopher. Very, very interesting paper. I think we'll have some things to talk about here at the end. I'll give the obligatory caveat here up front, which I think, Christopher, you kind of ended on, which is this is part of a larger project, and it's kind of an early draft here. But I think it will be able to make some interesting connections with what you were saying earlier, Cole, in your paper. And so I'll go ahead and jump in. Oh, I guess I should say, so I'm Joshua Murray. I'm an assistant professor at Fayetteville State University in North Carolina. And I just recently was the co-editor of a collected edited volume called Editing the Harlem Renaissance, which came out with Clemson University Press just the last month or two. So very, very excited about that. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'll go ahead and jump on in. So my paper today is titled Never Will Be a Hole Anywhere, Diasporic Disability and the Divided Self in Claude McKay's Romance in Marseille. Romance in Marseille, a manuscript drafted by McKay between the years 1929 and 1933 and unpublished during his lifetime, has recently gained renewed interest following its publication by Penguin Classics in 2020 and a special issue of April 2021 of English Language Notes, which was dedicated to the novel. The journal issues articles examine a range of topics from queer romance to primitivist literary tropes to maritime modernism. On the surface, Romance in Marseille appears to follow thematically with Claude McKay's earlier novels, Home to Harlem and Banjo, both of which highlight male characters engaged in transient vagabond lifestyles. However, a stark distinction sets Romance in Marseille apart from its predecessors when La Fala, who is our protagonist, undergoes a double leg amputation surgery in the opening pages of the novel. If Home to Harlem and Banjo explore racial liminality within a diasporic and transnational framework, Romance in Marseille compounds the narrative by highlighting the impact of bodily wholeness on the internal and external self. While La Fala initially fears he inhabits, quote, a strange land without home, without friends, without resources, without his greatest asset, his fateful feet, end quote, he grows to understand and accept his disability as uniquely characteristic of himself. La Fala's intersectional identity thus becomes immediately clear, yet the imposed situational code switching illuminates his divided self. The difference for La Fala is that his division is not limited to color or race. La Fala's foremost identifier oscillates from race, a black man, to nationality, an African man, to disability, highlighted by his nickname Pied Coupé, translated as Cutfoot. His social class, criminal record, and financial standing similarly rotate through the spotlight. So here I point to the fact that disability is conspicuously absent from the English Language Notes special issue that just recently came out, and I hope to remedy that in part in this project. So on one hand, I argue that McKay's use of a disabled protagonist is significant within the canon of Harlem Renaissance literature and within Anglophone literature as a whole during the early 20th century. La Fala's disability is not a one-dimensional token characteristic played for humor or pity. It impacts La Fala's story, but at the same time, it doesn't forcibly control the narrative at all times. La Fala appears as a believable man experiencing real-life events like health issues, relationships, financial gains and losses, and feelings of hopelessness and belonging. McKay's portrayal of him is nuanced and raw, creating a character who might fit in perfectly with our 21st century calls for thoughtful representation in literature and other media. On the other hand, the addition of disability into the conversation of African diasporic kinship presents McKay with a new vocabulary by which to explore selfhood. As the novel suggests, intersectionality and the search for belonging is endemic to diaspora, magnified even more greatly by the blatantly racist policies of the early 20th century. The eclectic characters in Romance in Marseille are variously characterized by race, nationality, language, color, religion, sexuality, gender identity, and political philosophy. In exploring these characters' individual quests, McKay at times uses language of disability metaphorically. While Lafala may feel the phantom pains of his missing limbs, the other characters feel the pains of their missing history. Lafala's disability arises out of a traumatic accident aboard a ship, leading to the amputation that he views as having his legs, quote unquote, jerked off of him. The answer for Lafala, however, is not regaining his legs. To be fair, he receives prosthetics that allow him to walk and dance again. But the true progress comes when he begins to find his identity in his current state. Similarly, centuries of colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade performed a cultural amputation, causing members of the African diaspora to mourn the loss of something so key to familial identity. Jesse W. Swartz lists the characteristics of the various subplots in Romance in Marseille as, quote, migrations, holds, ships, disabilities, literality, and the raced and gendered commodification of bodies, end quote, all of which he points to as the afterlives of slavery. This newfound language of disability thereby grants a new means by which McKay can underscore the sustained individual and communal trauma in diasporic modernism. Yet, as we see with several insightful characters, the story doesn't have to be tragic. To borrow a phrase from Wendy W. Walters, there can be home in diaspora. Romance in Marseille continues the trajectory of McKay's earlier novels by decentralizing the geographical focus away from the United States to a neutral site, namely the Marseille McKay first explored in his second novel, Banjo. And incidentally, McKay began drafting Romance in Marseille while he was also working on Banjo as well. The many characters find themselves in the dream port of Marseille for varying reasons, yet they all seek an idealized sense of self they have not yet achieved or could not achieve elsewhere. Rosemary Marangoli George explains this process when she posits, quote, the politics of location come into play in the attempt to weave together a subject status that is sustained by the experience of the place one knows as home, or by resistance to places that are patently not home. Location suggests the variable nature of both the home and the self, for both are negotiated stances whose shapes are entirely ruled by the site from which they are defined, end quote. This geographical setting creates a narrative ripe for explorations of identity. Marseille is a diasporic microcosm of expatriates, immigrants, and the displaced. So the necessarily multicultural and multilingual atmosphere leads to considerations of kinship and Blackness. With the protagonist Lafala, however, the opening paragraphs of the novel emphasize and even fetishize legs. As we come to discover, Lafala had been in Marseille for an extended period of time, and due to a multiplicity of factors, he decides to leave for the United States as a stowaway on a ship. Once caught, the crew lock him in a cold storage room, leading him to contract frostbite in his legs, which results in the necessary double leg amputation. When the novel opens, Lafala has just undergone the procedure, and he, quote, visualizes the glory and the joy of having a handsome pair of legs, end quote. More than just his own legs, however, he also remembers people of his tribe with, quote, fine bodies supported by strong gleaming legs, end quote. Cultural wisdom meant the utility of legs was necessary for tribal success in the areas of work and procreation. Quote, the older tribesmen appraised the worth of the young by the shape of their limbs. Long legs and slender made good swimmers. Stout legs and thick, good carriers. Lithe and sinewy were runners' legs. The lads fancied the girls by the form of their legs, the shape of hips and firmness of thighs in symmetrical motion, with coral-covered arms poised at oblique angles, steadying burdens on their heads, end quote. As remains the current cultural norm, Lafala first reckons with his new reality as a sense of loss, reminiscing on what he once did and what he now can no longer do. And so here's an extended quote here from the first chapter. Lafala as a boy was proud of his legs, participating in all of childhood's leg play, running and climbing and jumping and dancing in the moonlight in the village yard. Legs of ebony, legs of copper, legs of ivory, moving pell-mell in columns against his imagination. Dancing on the toes, dancing on the heels, dancing flat-footed. Lafala's dancing legs had carried him from Africa to Europe and from Europe to America. Legs, feet that were accustomed to dig themselves into the native soil, into lovely heaps of leaves and affectionate tufts of grass, were now introduced to luxuries of socks and shoes and beds of iron. Dance away. Think not of age, of accident, the festering and mortification of youth, and poisoned worms corroding through the firm young flesh to the sepulchral skeleton. His dancing legs would carry him over all. Suddenly they were jerked off, and there he lay helpless. End quote. La Falla had been taught all his life, both explicitly and implicitly, the cultural significance of his legs, their necessity for his personhood and his position within his tribe. His sudden obligatory amputation leads to a long journey, wherein he must truly examine what the seat of his selfhood actually is. Having his legs quote unquote jerked off seems to him that he just had his identity shattered, stolen from him. In an interesting narrative turn, however, La Falla soon discovers that he is entitled to monetary compensation from the shipping company for placing him in the hold that led to his amputation. This wrinkle complicates La Falla's ability to process his new reality, as his riches grant him pleasures formerly inaccessible to him, yet not without additional cost. Throughout the novel, then, his limb loss and financial gain conflate into two sides of the same coin, taking turns at the foremost, or as the foremost focus of La Falla's efforts. On his way from America back to Marseille, he considers his journey up to this point a Pyrrhic victory, with the loss of his legs offset by the autonomy and relative fame granted by his compensatory windfall. Elsewhere, however, he witnesses the negative side of his wealth, when others compete for a slice of the pie themselves. In a moment of exasperation, La Falla proclaims, "God, this money business is a bigger pain in the bone than it was sawing off my legs." While the money carries certain perks and advantages, he soon realizes that it can't erase the bodily trauma inflicted upon him. Quote, Marseille was a vastly changed place for him now that he had money. Sometimes a wave of regret swept over him, dampening his heart, when the music tickled his upper half and the lower could not respond to it. But that sadness soon vanished under the sensation of the new power that having money gave him. End quote. He eventually finds a middle ground, receiving a set of prosthetic legs as part of the legal settlement. His thoughts go immediately to his life before the accident. Quote, how would he look with a girl in the street? He might learn to dance with them and do the things that whole-legged people did. End quote. His prosthetics do return to him the ability to dance, with some aid from his partner. He remains, quote, sensitive about being seen without his artificial feet, end quote. But he clearly has adapted to his new life, and he feels more and more like himself, even leading to Lafleur, who was a former lover of his, to shriek, pied coupé, watch him strutting. Yet that ultimately leads La Falla to feel what ultimately leads La Falla to feel most comfortable and satisfied is not his prosthetics or his money. Instead, his relationship with Aslima becomes his primary motivation. Though the novel ends inconclusively with La Falla's return to West Africa and Aslima's death, his disability serves merely as the coincidental symptom that reveals a much larger wound beneath the surface. With this context of La Falla's disability, then, McKay's characterization of the other diasporic members of Marseille takes on a weightier meaning. In my remaining time, I'll provide a couple brief examples. In the midst of an odd, dreamlike vision, Aslima sees herself, quote, divided and struggling against herself, end quote. The vision paints her in stark contrast to La Falla as it continues, quote, she did not want to surrender all of her, but she could not detach herself. Fighting for release, she saw La Falla among the free and cried out fearfully to him, but he could not go to her. La Falla, La Falla, La Falla. But a high wall arose, shutting her off, and all was darkness, end quote. At another point near the end of the novel, Felipe and Saint Dominique, who is described as a mulatto from Martinique, have a disagreement in which Felipe states, quote, what you really need is a black kingdom with a vast court shaded with palms and ferns and a black king sitting on his ivory throne with his people around him and you a mediator between the people and the king, end quote. Saint Dominique responds, quote, I prefer this or any other Mediterranean port to any kind of black kingdom. Barcelona, Genoa, Naples, even Constantinople, end quote. Felipe then continues the argument by focusing on Saint Dominique's biracial identity, facetiously claiming, quote, you're not Negro anyway. You're half here and half there, and never will be a whole anywhere, end quote. And so to me, it's intriguing that this line, never will be a whole anywhere, which I kind of took that as the title for my presentation. This is being directed toward Saint Dominique, who is, again, this biracial individual, but it's looking at this concept of his wholeness of identity. And so it's not La Falla, who has this loss of limb, who is being considered as not being whole, but it's this other man whose racial identity in Marseille is being questioned. Since this is part of the Langston Hughes Society panel, I would be remiss if I didn't point out how Felipe's questioning of Saint Dominique's identity is a recurrent trope in diasporic fiction and nonfiction, as can be seen in Langston Hughes's 1940 autobiography, The Big Sea. Hughes recalls his first trip to Africa as a deckhand aboard a freighter, and he looks forward to meeting his ancestral kin with great delight. Yet much to his chagrin, the Africans he first encounters, quote, would not believe I was a Negro, end quote. Hughes begins the following chapter with the provocative statement, you see, unfortunately, I am not black. Throughout the chapter, Hughes delineates the ancestors who granted him partial claim to African, Caucasian, French, and Indian blood. This information factors into his feelings of inadequacy when the Africans reject him as one of their own. Nonetheless, his draw to the African diaspora and the kinship he has already known encourage him to continue forward in his quest for identity. Saidiya Hartman sheds light on the significance of Hughes's strangerhood in Africa and its impact on his appeal to oceanic travel and imagery as a means of locating kinship. Her own arrival mirrors Hughes's journey and solidifies a larger Pan-African dissociation between motherland and identity. Quote, my appearance confirmed it. I was the proverbial outsider. Old and new worlds stamped on my face, a blend of peoples and nations and masters and slaves long forgotten. In the jumble of my features, no certain line of origin could be traced. Clearly, I was not Fanti or Ashanti or Ewe or Ga, end quote. For many diasporic individuals, the symbolic pilgrimage to an ancestral home is met with discordant definitions of identity and belonging. But for at-large diasporic centers like Marseille, everyone is a transplant. Yet, as McKay's novel demonstrates, the quest for kinship at times clashes with competing ideations of selfhood and community classification. Later in the conversation between Felipe and Saint Dominique agrees with Felipe to a degree, yet he flips the statement away from himself into a more generalized direction. He says, we're all divided, all have a dual personality, brown, black, yellow, white. Even though La Falla is absent from this conversation, the subtext of disability is loaded. From the moment the novel opens on La Falla's psychological reckoning with his double amputation and its impact on his understanding of himself, his concern of now being divided and no longer being whole drives many of his subsequent interactions. What we see in these excerpts of these other characters is that this is not a unique experience that stems from La Falla's disability. Rather, the other residents of Marseille similarly struggle with their double and divided selves, what W.E.B. Du Bois terms double consciousness and what Ibram X. Kendi calls dueling consciousness. In this way, romance in Marseille, as a result of the vocabulary afforded via La Falla's disability, challenges and rewrites the modernist conception of racial identity. Disability in the novel produces a physical manifestation of the liminal incompleteness that exists at the collision of race, intersectionality, and diaspora. Not unlike similar texts of the time, the novel ends tragically and without a satisfactory resolution, yet La Falla's disability adds another layer to the narrative. The competing conflicts force all of the characters to question where their homes and identities truly lie. For La Falla specifically, the reader must question whether he will truly discover a satisfactory resolution back in Africa. Disability may focus and amplify La Falla's quest for identity and belonging, but it is not the impetus. The cultural trauma of colonialism and slavery create a shared liminality that McKay's novel is uniquely suited to explicate. Through this study, then, I hope to revise our understanding of the breadth of Harlem Renaissance literature and contribute to the contemporary necessity of placing disability and race in conversation with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for that wonderful presentation as well. Romance in Marseille is certainly a wonderful work by Claude McKay. We know that there are two existing versions of that novel, which are notably different because one has a more pronounced discussion of some of the LGBTQ themes that appear in other works by Claude McKay, which may be one of the contributing factors to it not being published during that time period, in addition to the racial commentary, the anti-capitalist commentary, the pro-communist discussions that appear at times within the text. So overall, I think this was a very interesting collection of papers because that theme of the fracturing of the self along different lines was pervasive in all three of the papers. So with the time that we have remaining, let's open it up for just some dialogue, because I think that's one of the things that I look forward to most within conferences is just the conversation between the panelists as we sort of build some shared understanding. So Josh, you asserted some connections, particularly with Cole's paper. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. I know, I'm a big fan of McKay's work as well. Like Christopher mentioned, you have written, I guess your dissertation was on McKay. But, I've been familiar with Home to Harlem and Banjo for a longer period of time than before I had my hands on, the manuscript of Romance. And, you mentioned the two extant versions of it. I began working on this project prior to the Penguin Classics edition that has recently been published. So it's kind of been in this limbo for me for a little while, but I've been mostly using that edition that the Schaumburg Center houses. But seeing the way that in each of McKay's novels, I feel like there is this primary character who it's always about this quest for identity, for belonging. With Home to Harlem, it is, we can question what home means. Is that sort of a ironic title, going home to Harlem? He doesn't start there and he doesn't end there in terms of Jake or Ray. But this quest for, how do I belong in these multiple spheres? How do I belong in this, in the American society for Home to Harlem? How do I belong within the diasporic blackness of identity? How do I belong within, African American or Haitian or these other identities? And so I think, just the complications of all these overlapping circles in the Venn diagram of intersectionality is just so interesting to me. And it's what has really, I think, drawn me back to McKay's work over and over again. And then, for me, looking at Romance in Marseille, kind of seeing the added disability aspect there. And even, we haven't mentioned it yet today, but Banana Bottom throwing in gender, having his one, female protagonist in any of his novels with Beta Plant. But yeah, I was already kind of seeing as Cole, as you were talking, I was seeing some of those connections there with what you were talking about. I was trying to take notes as you were going through, but, talking about the colonized subject's relation to the history, colonial marginality. You mentioned for Ray specifically, neither fitting in, but then not seeing anywhere that he could fit in, right? It's this kind of perpetual liminality, I feel like.
Absolutely. I think that I also see a lot of relay points between our presentations. I'm much less familiar, I think, with McKay and his work than both of you, but this paper is, one of those papers that almost got away that I'm sort of returning to after a bit of time. And I also realized I didn't really introduce myself earlier, but I'm at the University of California, Irvine. And while my work is mostly on visuality and technologies of photography in particular, the opportunity to return to Home to Harlem and to McKay is also an opportunity to think a little bit more about some critical terms, hybridity, creolite, negritude, that have been really foundational for a lot of my thinking through of race and identity. So I think that particularly the dissolution of the body or the attempt to cohere the identity has been a sort of perennial interest of mine. And I thought that your discussion of disability and the way that the discourse of disability is leveraged, you know, against at times, right? Claim to national, a coherent national identity and a sense of belonging in these, you know, inherently heterogeneous, in all types of ways, spaces, is really one of the fascinating through lines for me of Home to Harlem, Banjo, Romance in Marseille. And one of the things about the paper that I think interests me in growing it is to do what I was sort of foreshadowing in the last bit of my paper of tracing Ray as he drops out of Home to Harlem, and who is Ray when we re-encountered him in Banjo, right? What has elapsed in that time? That's a really fascinating thing, not only because of the story, but also because of the way that McKay seems to work with form and sort of challenge us to just focus on the characters, or focus on the claims being countered and leveraged against one another without kind of setting down authoritatively on, you know, one overarching vision of nationhood or ethnicity or juridical systems.
Yeah, I feel like McKay does, you know, a great job of, you know, working with the internal in his characters, but then having kind of this external, manifestation of it, right? And I always thought of in Home to Harlem, you know, Ray is much more of the internal guy, right? It's all kind of taking place in his head, whereas, you know, Jake is, you know, he can't sit still anywhere, right? He's constantly on the move, it feels like. And so in that way, you know, if you were to have just looked at Home to Harlem, you know, this is kind of my thoughts on it. You know, I almost feel like that Ray is in a better position at the end of the novel than Jake is. But then we get to Banjo, and Ray is still really trying to work through all of this, right? And you can see how just because, you know, they are presented in two different ways, and Jake learns a lot from Ray, there's still a lot that Ray is trying to process and comprehend. So yeah, I think a good job. I mean, for anyone to write something and it still be relevant, you know, 90 going on 100 years later, I think that's big.
Yeah, I agree with all of the perspectives that you all have offered here. I mean, when I think of McKay, I do put a lot of emphasis on that search for identity, but that's at the sort of personal, individual level. And I do think at times that McKay is interested in having a much larger, more widespread conversation than just the individual. So I'm looking particularly at intersections between that negritude thought and the Pan-Africanist thread in his work. I mean, to associate McKay with the Harlem Renaissance, many people suggest that that's a misconception because most of his writing wasn't even done in the United States, right? And when we look at the scope of the novels that he's written, most of them are set outside of the United States. So he's really interested in exploring the diaspora as a whole. But then tied to that are these Black nationalist sentiments. And so I've often argued that what McKay is attempting to do within his novels is to not search for a Black utopia, because he realizes that that doesn't exist within any specific place in the world, but to develop strategies for the construction of a Black utopia. So I think that his fiction works actually establish that blueprint, and each work has a specific socio-political ideology that he's attempting to communicate. And it just so happens to be that he ends up back in Harlem at the conclusion of that discussion with Amiable with Big Teeth. But even then, there's a discussion of the ways in which there are active forces to recolonize African-American spaces by the infiltration into uniquely Black organizations. So this is a really interesting conversation for me. I really wish that there was more work being done on McKay. He's done so much more than just 3 novels. And so the expansion into some of those other works, the discussions of Romance in Marseille, Amiable with Big Teeth, the additional novel, which the name escapes me at the current moment, his work in Gingertown, the collection of short stories, his 2 autobiographical works, all of that is really fruitful territory for exploration. And yet he is still most widely known for his If We Must Die, right? And at the same point, putting into conversation with the fact that Claude McKay was an exile himself, even within the Harlem Renaissance. We know about Du Bois's sort of scathing review of Home to Harlem. Alain Locke had some commentary about Claude McKay being a spiritual truant, being the enfant terrible. And so seeing how he fits within that larger tradition, but also is trying to expand it, and how there's a resistance to that at times within the movement, I think is a really interesting dimension to the study of McKay.
Yeah, and Christopher, not to, I have no idea what our time limit here is, but I think what you're doing in your paper is really fascinating too. I don't want to spend the whole time just talking about McKay, but the way that you are, I think, taking this work, Scottsboro Limited by Hughes, from 1931, right, and then applying it to our contemporary period. I think it's really fascinating. It's, I think, every time I teach James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, my students are always, kind of blown away that, this was originally written in 1912. This is still relevant to us today, and I think seeing that same sort of thing and you putting that specifically into conversation with, the movement for Black Lives, with everything that's kind of been happening in the last few years for us here in America, right? But then you're also reaching back and you're pulling in I.W. Wells's A Red Record, and I think it's fascinating and interesting, and important for us to continue to rely on our predecessors and what they've done. But at the same time, it's also, it's unfortunate that we have to continue relying on these things, right, in our contemporary moment, that they do remain so relevant. But yeah, I thought it was a fascinating kind of approach that you took. And so I don't know if you have more to say on that, or even, I know you mentioned briefly you're kind of working towards this project of, applying more works of the Harlem Renaissance to kind of our contemporary moment with Black Lives Matter and everything.
I mean, absolutely. So at a previous institution, I was part of a committee that was responsible for selecting the book, the common read that new incoming students would engage with. And it happened to be the anniversary of the publication of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And so someone had nominated that as the text for students to read, and it was eventually rejected because members of the committee felt that slavery was over and there was no longer a need to have conversations about it. And I found that to be a very unfortunate statement and belief. And then when I look at that in the contemporary moment, similar claims can be made by some sectors of society about African-American literature at large. If there is this belief among some sectors of society that we're moving toward a post-racial society, then that enables us to erase, ignore, and avoid conversations of race, which is what's happening with these many bans on CRT nationwide, right? And so I find that to be fundamentally problematic because we are not in a post-racial society, and to avoid issues of race when they are ever present is to ignore realities that shape our understanding of ourselves and the society in which we live. So we can't firm up an understanding of nationhood if we're not going to talk about some of the integral factors that are shaping our current understanding of what that nation looks like. So that's part of the reason in particular that I'm interested in drawing connections between literature of the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Lives Matter movement in the present. It's also, stemming in large part from conversations with students, because that's what my students like to talk about when we look at any of the literature of the past. Like, so we spend a lot of time looking at the context and what the text meant in the moment in which it was written and when it was published. But then they also want to look at, why are we reading it now in the current historical moment? What significance does that play on their perspective? And so those texts of the past give us important language to understand what's happening. It gives us some tools to articulate what's going on. But I also highly consider the authors of the past to be intellectual thinkers. And they're doing some important work in outlining strategies for social, cultural, and political reform. And rather than starting from a blank slate for social change in the present, I think we should go back and look at what the authors have already established and see what strategies could be applicable to the current moment to do some kinds of substantive change. Because far too often the strategies to tackle racism and white supremacy and any sort of problematic structure is this top-down approach, which doesn't work because it doesn't have buy-in from the people, either the people who are in need of change or the people who are marginalized historically, but also because a singular approach just isn't going to work to something that's structural in nature. And so my students have often asked me the question, like, so now that we've done the first step of acknowledging what the problem is, what do we do next to actually fix it? And that's where they run into those roadblocks where their ultimate answer is it needs some sort of radical social transformation, which often ends up in their minds with blowing up the Constitution and starting from scratch. And so I just want to provide them with a better understanding of what some of the strategies are that have been vocalized and haven't necessarily been put into practice that could be really beneficial. And I think Claude McKay fits into that conversation. So I am working on a book project that's going to extend my dissertation and do more of that work with McKay. And I'm always drawn to a statement that he makes in his autobiography, A Long Way from Home, about the lack of what he terms a Black group soul. And so he actually, like Zora Neale Hurston and many of the authors of the Harlem Renaissance, was not in support of integration when that conversation was taking place, because he actually argued that the African-American community needed to develop a Black group soul, strengthen their economic social capital before they tried to push for integration. Because otherwise they would always maintain a second-class status because there wasn't cohesion within the community. And part of the reason for that is colorism, the consistent divides that were maintained during the institution of slavery. So many different factors that were destabilizing for the African-American community. And these are contemporary conversations, though. So when there's a buy Black movement or bank at Black institutions movements and those kinds of, they're all saying the same thing, right? So students are aware of those ideas, but not the roots of those ideas. So I want to show them how that's embedded in the literature. And I think that that's really, really important work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You go ahead, Cole.
Yeah, I would just add that I heard it in both of your presentations, but something that I often think about when designing, my courses, and I should say that, I'm teaching this year for the first time in a quarter system, which goes by like that. And so the challenge of fitting, any kind of arc into the term becomes kind of differently important. And particularly maybe with writers like McKay or Hughes or Wells, or I'm also thinking of Hansberry, capturing the sort of diversity of their bodies of work, and sort of mapping that onto, whatever understanding your students are coming into the class with already, right? A sense of Harlem Renaissance or the Black Arts movement, right? As these sort of hermetically sealed periods in history, right? That's always a challenge that I really enjoy, is trying to sort of place maybe the minor texts or even the major texts of maybe relatively minor figures, right, into historical moments that might seem incongruous, right? And I think that what really is underscored in that respect is what you were mentioning, Christopher, about the extent to which these writers, as thinkers, right, and as just members of society, right, are kind of firing on all pistons, right, to stage a series of almost documentary conversations or sort of instigative investigations or queries, right, about social issues that were prevalent and, as we recognize in hindsight, also perennial, right? So, the question, I think, becomes even more urgent, right? Why does Hughes write a play here to respond to this issue? Why does a poem seem the way to go? Why does this turn into a novel? And again, I think this is, rhyming with what you were saying, Christopher, pushing students to, go beyond, right, the good work of recognizing, similarities, right, to then ask about, what are some of the affordances or the purchases of different genres, different literary forms, right, as a way to substantiate the work of the scholars and the thinkers and the writers and the artists that we're studying. That seems like, the rich work of making these past moments speak to our present without sort of this just kind of relegating them to they're right just because they said it, right, or they're right because they came before our present moment, right? They're right because they are engaging in the sort of aesthetic mediation, right, of a set of questions.
Absolutely. And that's particularly why I'm interested in the study of both McKay and Hughes, because they often had a tendency to explore the same idea across genre. So McKay, for instance, we know one of his nonfiction books that was tracing the African-American experience during the Great Depression, it wasn't really well received. And so he turns that into the novel known as Harlem Glory, a fragment of Afro-American life. And Hughes does similar things. So like the Scottsboro limited play that I'm mentioning was also a series of poems that he composed, right? And so appealing to different audiences through the use of genre, but still engaging in a really deep and necessary social and political project. I mean, these authors, they were writing for money. That we can't deny that fact. But I don't think their primary purpose was just to entertain. I think they had a larger political agenda that they were trying to achieve with their works. And so I appreciate the work that both of you have done in sort of articulating some of those threads with this conversation. So thank you everyone for joining us as part of the Langston Hughes Society panel at the 2021 American Literature Association Conference. Please feel free to look at the other projects and calls for papers that we have available on our website, www.langstonhughessociety.org. And please consider becoming a member. With that membership, you will gain access to the Langston Hughes Review. You'll be able to join any panels or publish within the Langston Hughes Review, and then there is a commemorative Langston Hughes Society pin that we send to each of you. And if you all haven't gotten yours, it's on the way in the mail. Right? So thank you all again, and have a blessed day.